This video is about the Ohio derailment in February, but it's also about so much more than that. I think we have a real problem in this country of taking real issues and turning them into conspiracies, thus completely sanitizing any lessons we could learn from them. Because of the sheer amount of disinformation, I first need to establish what happened in Ohio. If you aren't interested in the full story, you can skip to the timecode on screen. And remember to subscribe if you want to see more content like this. Sorry, I'm forced to ask this by the algorithm. Allegedly, on February 3rd, 2023, a Norfolk Southern Railroad train fell victim to an axle failure on one of its carts. This began around 8 p.m. in Salem, Ohio, and the train cart made it to the small residential town of East Palestine, Ohio, where it crashed off the rails. 38 of the 149 train carts were affected by the derailment, including 11 of 20 carts containing severely toxic chemicals, which began leaking. The following day, a rapid temperature shift was detected within the carts, creating a risk for an explosion that would be so massive it would shoot parts of the train through houses up to a mile away. The following morning, an evacuation began, and within the following 48 hours, the railroad company, Norfolk Southern, initiated a controlled release of the chemicals from the carts. Rather than capture the chemicals, Norfolk Southern did a slow, controlled explosion. Residents of East Palestine have since moved back into their homes, but reports of strange-looking drinking water, oily rivers, and thousands of dead pets, livestock, and fish remain ongoing. When filing standard railroad paperwork, Norfolk Southern did not mark the train as containing hazardous materials. Best I can tell, marking the train as having hazardous materials would have cost Norfolk Southern more money. And because of lobbying efforts, they legally don't have to if the vast majority of the train carts are not carrying hazardous products. Norfolk Southern was sketchy about the details of what chemicals were present on the first few days of the incident. We later found the damaged train carts spilled a ton of chemicals that I'm not smart enough to pronounce, including 688,000 pounds of polyvinyl, 273,000 pounds of ethyl lexyl acrylate, 273 pounds of ethylene glycol monobutyl ether, and 206,000 pounds of butyl acrylates. I really hope I said some of that correctly. These aren't even the worst chemicals that were dumped into Ohio's ecosystem, as due to the explosion risk, Norfolk Southern cut additional holes into the carts to release 1.1 million pounds of vinyl chloride, a Group A carcinogen known to cause rapid onset cancers, brain damage, liver damage, skin and bone changes, birth defects, infertility, and dozens of other medical conditions. I sound like a medication commercial rattling all these off, but there are way more than what I just mentioned. The first symptoms of acute exposure mostly happen within the nervous system, causing headaches, dizziness, and drowsiness, which were all reported by Ohio residents after the crash. So, yeah, probably not something we should launch into the air with a long-burning Chernobyl explosion. While vinyl chloride is released from select factories, with it being used to make PVC, in 2021, the highest emitter of vinyl chloride in America released 68,000 pounds of it, compared to 1.1 million pounds in Ohio. Not to mention, when vinyl chloride is burned, it turns into a poisonous, odorless, colorless gas, which was used as a chemical weapon in World War I, killing 85,000 people during the conflict. It shouldn't be a surprise that many people in Ohio are reporting a wide range of health reactions. Fun fact, well, maybe just fact, birds' lungs absorb whatever's in the air directly into their bloodstream, so for a lot of human history we determined air safety with birds. It's where we got the term canary in the coal mine. Well, people's parrots and chickens started just dropping dead far outside of the evacuation zone, as a burning plastic smell permeated the state of Ohio for days. Even though humans don't absorb chemicals through their lungs as quickly or efficiently as birds, it's still disturbing to think about the chemicals kind of just covering Ohio and potentially lingering in some surrounding states as well. Thankfully, I live 6 hours away from East Palestine. My birds seem to be totally fine best I can tell. But considering how bad the water quality already was in my area, first world country by the way, I'm still going to be using bottled water as usual. Speaking of water, it seems the initial spill made it into the Ohio River and is likely contaminating the rain as well. And with with contaminated animals migrating into other states, there likely will be some residual effects. According to officials, the Ohio River is large enough to dilute these chemicals down to safe levels, but there's still safety concerns in the immediate area of the derailment. The Republican governor of Ohio refused to declare this a disaster. He also refused to take Biden up on federal assistance. Finally, the Biden administration decided to send the Federal Emergency Management Agency to East Palestine, Ohio. Donald Trump somehow took credit for Biden's decision and made it about himself as usual. Ultimately, it seems the striking railroad workers predicted this better than anyone, as Norfolk Southern has committed countless safety violations in the name of profit. Safety be damned was the literal wording according to a striking worker last year. In fact, this entire disaster was predicted by striking railroad workers. It's almost like they had some good points, and Biden shouldn't have used the federal government to stop them from protesting. At first, it seemed like the train derailment was kind of underreported, though it's important to remember that these derailments happen all the time in America, mostly due to underfunding of infrastructure, but also the railroad corporations ruthlessly cutting corners in the name of profit. We're going to get into that later in this video. But this derailment was a bit worse than your normal derailment, and it had some cover-up vibes going on. Not to sound like I have Fox News brain rot or anything. A cable news reporter was arrested in the middle of covering the story early on. After the story blew up a bit more, the reporter was exonerated of all criminal charges. Norfolk Southern also built a replacement railway directly on top of the toxic chemical spill. That makes any remediation way harder, though I personally believe they did that to protect their profits and keep the line operational, but that also does have some cover-up vibes to some people. I think these vibes, if you will, served as the stench which attracts insects like Fox News. All the pundits on Fox News have been non-stop reporting on East Palestine over the past week. Maybe gay M&Ms and promoting cigarettes finally got too boring, but their coverage has been interesting, to say the least. It's very... how do I put this? Sound the alarms, they're out to get us. Maybe we did a few cleansings of all the homosexual degenerates, this would never have happened. That sort of thing. Typical Tucker Carlson coverage. You know, the type of coverage that in lawsuits has to be determined as entertainment rather than news because there's almost no factual information being presented. But his interview about East Palestine with Forbidden Daddy, hold up, sorry. Millionaire Republican Senator J.D. Vance was particularly interesting.
The tragedy in Palestine, in your state, kind of points up that something is kind of wrong with the fundamentals. I mean, if there are hundreds of train derailments, like, who's paying attention to this stuff and trying to prevent it?
Wow, Tucker Carlson, of all people, is going to support the investment and regulation of infrastructure?
Well, Tucker, we've had hundreds of train derailments after we spent over $1 trillion on infrastructure in this country. So the fact that this isn't getting obviously better is a major indictment of the people spending the money and what they're spending the money on. Now, we know if you listen to Secretary Buttigieg today, that they are focused more on whether we have too many white men in construction jobs than he is on the fundamentals of his job, which is ensuring we have a viable transportation infrastructure.
Wow, that was slick. Almost as slick as Senator Vance saying he doesn't take oil money and then proceeding to quietly take donations from ExxonMobil. But sure, it wasn't deferred maintenance that crashed the train. It was political correctness. Yeah. Within about 20 seconds, they managed to take ruthless profit-driven corner cutting by Norfolk Southern and turn it into an issue about the president giving $1 trillion to affirmative action. Which, like, no. Biden's $1 trillion infrastructure deal was actually $550 billion of new federal spending, split over the next 10 years. Considering we spend $800 billion a year on the military, I think it's worth it, considering the deal was already so penny-pinched by Republicans that it won't even fully remove lead pipes from our water supply anymore. Which is like, you know, something we'd want to do with our infrastructure in the 21st century, I would imagine. But this slots perfectly into a narrative currently being spun by Republicans. As last week, Marjorie Taylor Greene blessed us with whatever this is on C-SPAN.
Can you tell me how much money was given to Drag Queen Story Hour?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Who?
Drag Queen Story Time, where men dress up as women and read confusing books to children.
First, I thought you said dry clean. So, I'm sorry. No, I don't know the answer to either one of those two.
Can you tell me how much COVID cash went to CRT?
CRT?
Critical race theory in education. It's a racist curriculum.
No, I do not know that, but I do know that there's provisions that the federal funds generally are not used, are supposed to be used for curriculum.
Oh.
That's a state.
Oh, Mr. Dodaro, I have to tell you, in Illinois, they received $5.1 billion at an elementary school there that used it for equity and diversity.
$5.1 billion for one diversity program at one elementary school. Sure, sounds good. The other day, Biden paid me $15 billion to get sodomized by a drag queen inside a NICU. Gotta confuse them while they're still in the incubators, am I right? Next year, I'll probably be richer than Jeff Bezos. I mean, who's to say otherwise if an elected member of Congress gets to do whatever this is on C-SPAN? Oh, interesting. In case you forgot how manufactured and sort of interconnected this conservative outrage machine is, J.D. Vance actually got her to come out to his campaign events too. I wonder how much he paid Marjorie Taylor Greene, considering her $175,000 wasn't enough apparently.
My constituents in East Palestine have been some of the main victims of the fact that we have failing infrastructure in our country, again, after spending tons of money in an effort to actually fix it. So the problem we have, Tucker, is that we are ruled by unserious people who are worried about fake problems. You mentioned the Environmental Protection Agency. Of course, it says it right there. It should be focused on clean air, clean water. It's the thing that I'm most focused on for the people of East Palestine, but so often they're focused on environmental racism.
That's bold of him to talk about the EPA, when the day the derailment happened, Republicans were actively fighting the EPA's water regulations. You know, the one thing I keep thinking to myself when I watch conservatives talk about things is that they're almost there. The entire point of the conservative media machine is to take real problems and neutralize them if they impact corporate interests. We have a terrible for-profit medical system that places money above all else. But instead of bringing awareness to medication price fixing, insurance monopolies, or a lack of universal health care, we're made fearful of a vaccine technology that's been around since the 1980s. Instead of bringing awareness to evil oil companies, we're made to believe Biden is single-handedly raising gas prices because he's quirky or something. Gee, I wonder why. It's almost like Fox News is directly funded by ExxonMobil. Instead of advocating for paying teachers more than an average Walmart employee, we're made fearful of the books they're reading. Instead of bringing attention to private corporations overcharging the government billions of dollars in the form of military contracts, we're made to believe that this only happens when minorities are involved. Instead of calling out the horrible railroad industry and, risk siding with the workers, we're made to believe this is the fault of a gay guy and all of his diversity training.
Buttigieg held up his right hand and swore an oath to Kamala Harris to be the best darn Secretary of Transportation he could be. Just weeks into the job, Buttigieg discovered that some of the roads he was supposed to be overseeing, the roads he was now secretary of, were in fact racist.
We know, if you listen to Secretary Buttigieg today, that they are focused more on whether we have too many white men in construction jobs.
When Fox News sets out to cover a story like East Palestine, you can almost sense an anxiety that they might not be able to kill any lingering resentment against the status quo. I think that's why Tucker Carlson nearly comes when J.D. Vance brings up the conspiracy about $1 trillion going to diversity training. Literally quietly moaning, "Thank you."
Over $1 trillion on infrastructure in this country. So the fact that this isn't...
So what is causing hundreds of train derailments across the country? What factor is Tucker Carlson desperately compensating for in this clip that he's so scared might come up? Well, it comes down to a few factors, both of which Tucker Carlson could never say on Fox News, lest he piss off his oil sponsors. Firstly, if we stopped relying on plastic so much, we wouldn't need to ship out millions of pounds of vinyl chloride across the country every year. But let's just assume that's not going to change, because American politicians would rather us start sweating microplastics than stop getting fancy dinners with Exxon lobbyists. So, if vinyl chloride and all these other plastic-producing toxic chemicals must be shipped, We should do them safely. Even though conservatives would rather use reactionary distraction tactics, the reality stands that what happened in Ohio was simply the outcome of unfettered capitalism. The thing about capitalism is it necessitates infinite growth. Corporations want to post record profits in every quarterly earnings report to shareholders, which means they need to achieve infinite exponential growth. With shareholder value for that quarter being the top goal, corporations are not working sustainably, even when it comes to sustaining their own business. Rather than spend $3 billion to replace train braking systems nationwide, in 2022, Norfolk Southern announced $10 billion of stock buybacks. If you don't know what that means, rather than spend any of their $12 billion of yearly revenue on maintenance or safety, Norfolk Southern decided to spend almost all of that on buying their own stocks, which increases the value and scarcity for shareholders. Essentially, the executives at Norfolk Southern hold stock in the company, so they can decide to buy back the stock with corporate profits and revenue, which then makes them more money directly. They are laundering money through the company. They announced these stock buybacks on April 1st, just like the absolute joke it is. Without regulations forcing companies to do the right thing, they won't do the right thing. And unfortunately for Fox News, Norfolk Southern is a very easy example for this. In 2012, Norfolk Southern had 105 accidents involving hazardous materials. In 2022, it had risen to 654. That's like 2 hazardous material crashes per day. But yeah, the real problem is gay people, according to the media. After another spill of vinyl chloride in 2012, the Obama administration proposed safety regulations for hazardous chemicals like the one spilled in Ohio. But after industry lobbying, the final regulation only focused on crude oil and exempted most other trains carrying hazardous materials. But that regulation just wasn't weak enough, apparently, because once we got Trump in office, and with Republicans generally being even more ridiculously accommodating to corporate interests, like Democrats are bought out, but then Republicans are just even more so, this weak regulation was partially repealed. Railroad industry donors paid over $6 million into Republican campaigns during the 2016 elections. So, as a result, by 2017, better braking systems were no longer in the works for railroads. While better braking systems and regulations on hazardous materials would have gone a long way, railroad companies are avoiding far more than just those two things to maximize profits. For those in the audience listening closely, you might have noticed the Norfolk Southern train was about 150 cars long, which sounds like a lot. That's because Norfolk Southern in the past 10 years has increased train sizes by 20%, cut staffing by 40%, and has resisted and lobbied their way out of preparing their infrastructure to even handle these huge trains running on skeleton crews. And while libertarians in the audience will probably say something like, well, that can't be true. Why would a company do all these unsustainable practices that would hurt their ability to do the entire thing the company sets out to do? Like, this is a railroad company, so why would they make it harder for themselves to be an effective railroad company? What these libertarians and conservatives don't understand is that there's no self-regulation happening because they're not looking into the future. They're not thinking, oh, let's skip some infrastructure now so we can make some profits now, but we gotta get on this later because in the future this will cause a lot of problems. No, they're just looking at, getting their shareholder payouts within the next quarter or two. They're not thinking in the future. They are fixated on the next few quarters. Like, they straight up took their severely decaying infrastructure and decided to put it under more stress than it was even designed for. With a situation as inexcusable as this, Fox News seems to be unable to maintain usual control over the narrative. So they actually have to kind of say companies can do bad things sometimes. But rather than talk about anything specific, as these problems are not just Norfolk Southern problems, but are true for nearly every corporation in America, J.D. Vance laser focuses specifically on Norfolk Southern. They're just a bad apple, worsened under the strain of political correctness, somehow, in really undefined ways. Like, seriously, the whole political correct angle, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, what policies are impacting the railroads? This all makes Biden's spending seem less effective. Like, cool, we're gonna put $66 billion into railroad infrastructure now. But if we aren't going to regulate these corporations, this is just a subsidy for their bottom line. From my view, it seems like in America, even the few in government who want to do the right thing are scared of corporations. They have become our pseudo-government. Like, company towns are coming back, and it seems like big pharma, big tech, big everything is essentially dominating our lives at this point. And we're happy to band-aid the problem with a tiny bit of federal spending rather than address the root cause. Even if we did want to solve these problems through federal spending, the federal spending we're able to get past Republicans is like a thimble of water in hell. We're not addressing the root cause of these problems because they necessitate regulating companies and making public options of certain industries like utilities. An example is that we're trying to partially forgive student loans, but they remain so predatory that you can pay into them for 20 years and still owe more than you borrowed, and we're just doing nothing about that. Notice how in the Fox News clip they mentioned diversity-based hiring multiple times, but not the fact Norfolk Southern's workforce has gone from 30,000 to 18,000 in the last 6 years, despite having record amounts of business. Also, diversity-based hiring leading to a train crash just implies when you hire anything other than white men, they'll do a worse job somehow. It's subtle supremacy being put on full display. Though, it's not like Fox News wants to validate the concerns of the workers, and boy did the workers have some concerns. For those of you in the audience who can still remember more than a week back, which sure isn't me at this point, I'm smoking a lot to get through late-stage capitalism right now, railroad workers almost single-handedly shut down the economy and supply chains last holiday season by threatening to strike. The mainstream media absolutely smeared them, with even our most left-leaning outlets like the New York Times randomly pointing out that they make up to $100,000 excluding overtime. Hey, remember when the New York Times published hate symbols over and over again, including on the first day of Hanukkah a few months ago? And then, at the same time, published multiple anti-trans articles? Yeah, I wonder if that's related. In the past 6 years alone, railroad companies across the board have cut their workforce by 29%, despite record profits. With this greater demand being placed on a skeleton crew, the working conditions have deteriorated, even though they were never great to begin with. Railroad workers now have to be on call 90% of the time, and have to be at work within 90 to 120 minutes of being called at any time. Now, you're probably wondering how you're supposed to have a sleep schedule if you can be called into work at basically any time. You don't. Historically, workers have just had to deal with that. With a starting pay of $50,000 and the dwindling prospects for rural or blue-collar workers, this was worth it for them, even if their mental and physical health rapidly deteriorated from sleep deprivation. The only consistent time they're allowed to not be working is the federally mandated time off after each shift, which is usually spent in a hotel room wherever the train decides to take them. But those precious few hours after a 10, 12, or 14-hour shift, they don't really help much. Even when railroad companies do follow the law, the shifts start at random times, so you may start at 3 a.m. on some days and 2 p.m. on other days. There's also literally no way to stop working 7 days a week. If a worker has the full 30 attendance points, which sounds as dystopian as it is, but takes both Thanksgiving and Christmas Day off, they would run out of points just by taking those Tuesdays off and risk being fired. Say your wife is dying in the hospital, but it happens to be on New Year's Day. Taking that day off would use 15 points, and the only way to make points back is to be on call 24/7 for 14 days straight, which only gives you around 4 points back. If you get sick during those 14-day periods of continuous 24-hour work, maybe because your immune system is failing from sleep deprivation, you lose those points too. The point system is arbitrary and done at employer discretion. Some offenses may only cost you 2 points, while others may cost you far more. There's not really much of a rhyme or reason. It's completely arbitrary. This is just on top of huge safety concerns, which was also a huge reason why workers wanted to strike to begin with. Instead of staffing multiple trains, these companies are trying to merge the carts into giant, poorly maintained trains staffed by one sleep-deprived person. Rather than letting these workers exercise their First Amendment right to strike these objectively terrifying conditions, Biden blocked them from being able to, citing the drastic effects it would have on our economy. But out of the kindness of his own heart, he gave them all that extra time off they were rejecting. You know, the 1 day of paid time off, scheduled at the mercy of the corporations. This leaves workers without the sick leave they were asking for. So if you're sick, you can't just be like, let me take my personal day, you know, my one personal day. Railroad corporations have the highest profit margins of any industry in America, and I can see why. Yet, I understand why people are making this a conspiracy, because aside from the Fox News takes on this, there's a lot of people making insane claims right now. Like Twitter accounts posting a Netflix trailer from last year for a film about a train crash releasing toxic chemicals, or posting news coverage from 3 months ago about East Palestine's new emergency medical systems. I think it's far more comforting to believe there's just one bad actor or some organization causing all of our problems, rather than the fact that our essential infrastructure is owned by companies that solely care about profits. Rather than acknowledge this is the natural end to unfettered capitalism, they would rather believe that if they just, you know, defeat some sort of bad actor out there, this would all be fine. It's also comforting to believe that good things happening is a natural outcome of our system. That maybe if we regulated railroads even less, everything would be great. It would just all self-regulate because corporations love spending more money on their workforce. God, I hate the Heritage Foundation. The #1 demand of Railroad Workers United was public ownership of the railroads. The workers bared witness to massive safety violations and corner cutting within the railroad industry. They predicted these disasters would happen in the name of profit. They know that everywhere in the world where the government owns the railroads, these bad things just don't usually happen as often. I think if anything, we need to listen to them, but also think about the other essential industries harmed by privatization. Think about how we spend hundreds of dollars a month on internet from companies that give such poor service. Or utility companies that suddenly double our power or gas bills for utilities that are some of the worst in the first world. Or Big Pharma charging $2,000 for medications that cost $10 in Europe, even if they're researched or developed outside of the US. We really need to face the facts about privatized infrastructure and learn from that. Anyway, that'll be it for this video. I want to know what you think of this new format that I'm trying out, so leave a comment down below. Remember to like and subscribe. Thank you guys so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.